Hello, my History 461 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is now week 5, going into week 6. And going into week 6. And just want to comment on a couple of things around where we are right now. We're more than halfway through the course, right? Moving into the civil rights period, the official civil rights period of American history. And so this part of the course covers everything, basically all the highlights. The Brown v. Ward decision of 1954, Rosa Parks not giving up her seat on the front of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama in December 1st, 1955, Friday evening, right? There's the creation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the emergence of Martin Luther King Jr. as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You try to say all that all the time. Um, this head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, in 1957, and as a national leader of the Civil Rights Movement. The growth of that movement and the mobilization of people to end segregation, legal, through the courts and through protests and sit-ins and other things and marches, in Little Rock, Arkansas, at the University of Mississippi and University of Alabama, at lunch counters in Greensboro, North Carolina, at in restaurants and stores and shops all across the Deep South, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Culminating in protests in Birmingham to gradually lead toward the Kennedy administration saying, hey, civil rights movement, we need to have a Civil Rights Act to protect this movement and protect the rights of African Americans, and eventually have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is to make it to protect the rights of African Americans to vote. The one thing I'll say very quickly about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and this is really important, let me say this twice. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 did not grant African Americans the right to vote. All right? Again, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 did not grant African Americans the right to vote. African Americans got that right to vote under the 15th Amendment for black men in 1870, and for women, which happened to include all African American women, under the 19th Amendment in 1920. It just made it so that poll taxes and literacy tests and citizenship tests and grandfather clauses and a million other things, and violence and other things that whites were doing in the South to keep blacks from voting couldn't be done. That's what the Voting Rights Act was able to do, right? Of course, it's been gutted in the years since. We can talk about that in weeks 7 and 8, but that's not what we're talking about right now. So that's the civil rights movement. This is the way textbooks do it. It's the way your OERs are going to do it. It's the way that the class has been constructed, not by yours truly. Again, let me remind you, even though I teach this course, the way University of Maryland Global Campus does things is that anything that's part of the course has been agreed to by a committee, by a majority of people on the committee who are not me, right? And so those folks, when they decide on things, they decide on the readings and they decide to go in certain directions. These are not all the directions I would go in, just so that you know. So let me real quickly just jump back to one quick thing about, I've graded all of your midterm exams. Technically speaking, all of you did anywhere between decent and perfect, right? The lowest score was a 210 out of 300, that's 70%, and the highest score was 300. 4 of you scored 300. Given the fact that it was a take-home exam that I've actually gone over and essentially giving you an answer to every question on there at some point in time or another over the course of the first 4 weeks of the course, the lowest grade, most of you should have scored a 90 or 100. Most of you did, but I think most of you should have scored a 300 out of 300, to be honest with you. The questions that people most commonly got wrong involved how did Reconstruction come to, essentially why did Reconstruction fail, right? And it wasn't the prominence of the Democratic Party, because they weren't prominent. They were growing in strength, but they were not prominent. The word prominence kind of key here. When you look at multiple choice exams, every word matters. So if I say prominent, you might go, maybe they're not prominent. About half of you got that question wrong. And the other question was about is an accept question, which is basically everything else is true, but, right? And most of you marked everything else. I'd say more than half of you marked everything else other than the one thing that wasn't true, that South funded public colleges and universities, specifically for black college students. They did not. There were plenty of private black colleges and universities founded in this period, in the period of Reconstruction and in the Jim Crow period, to be sure. Howard's one, Hampton's another, Tuskegee's another. What becomes Clark Atlanta was just Atlanta University for a while. It's another one, Morris Brown, Morehouse, Spelman, Jackson State. I could keep going. Alcorn State, Grambling, on and on and on. The one thing all these universities have in common is that they were privately founded, which means they had to collect money from people, donors, in order to open, right? Whether it was Booker T. Washington having to do it, or General Howard having to do it, because that's how Howard University got founded, or Hampton University, which, by the way, Booker T. Washington also played a role in founding as well. So just if you go through that list, the one thing all those schools have in common is that they're not publicly funded by the states in which they're in. Alabama's not funding black schools. neither is Mississippi or any of these other states. They're not publicly funded, not by the states. And it's not until the 1920s or 30s when the federal government starts providing funding to historically black colleges and universities. So that's why you got that question wrong, right? So those are the two most common ones that people screwed up on. And words really do matter in this case. And so it's just a skill. And most of you scored an 240 out of 300 or higher. Half of you scored basically a 90% or 100%, 270 or 300. So that's fine, but more would have been better. It kind of skews where people are a little bit. You'll recover over the next few weeks with discussion. And your final exam is much longer. You have 20 questions, plus you have short answer, plus you have fill in the blanks. So most of you should do much, much better on this one, comparatively speaking. Not that people did bad, but my point is you have more opportunities to not lose that many points. So there's that. Anyway, let me quickly go over what I've summarized, which is the beginning of the civil rights movement. Capital C, capital R, capital M's civil rights movement. 1954 to 1965, roughly. And the main thing I want to concentrate on are two things, right? Because it's too much to try to do everything, right? Every blow and every hit. By the way, the movie Eyes on the Prize, the documentary series Eyes on the Prize, which came out in the late 1980s, 1989, I believe, is now available publicly again. I think PBS might have it. I'm not certain. But if you wanted an extreme blow-by-blow, there's either that or the 3-volume set on Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement by Taylor Branch, right? So those two cover in excruciating detail every hit, every triumph, every victory, every defeat, every setback of the civil rights era, up until the death of Martin Luther King. That's a nice way of putting it. The assassination of Martin Luther King on Thursday, April 4th, 1968, around 6 p.m. Memphis time, which we just went through anniversary, I believe, 54 earlier this month. So anyway, number one, civil rights movement didn't start in 1954 and didn't end in 1968. Maybe the mass mobilization period known as the civil rights movement has those bookend dates. But as I've been saying all semester, one of the central themes of African American history is the constant struggle for equality and rights. And if that's a constant struggle, that means there's always a movement going on toward equality and civil rights among African Americans. It doesn't matter if the year is 1890 and 90% of African Americans are either domestic servants or sharecroppers or farmers in the South. It doesn't matter, right? There are someone's out there doing some form of agitation. It's nothing more than writing a newspaper like Ida B. Wells Barnett, or taking people to court like Plessy did. Homer Plessy actually took um, the governor of Louisiana all the way to the Supreme Court over his right to ride in a streetcar. Here's a man who's literally like almost 90% white by heritage, but because of the one drop rule, he's treated as if he's, a 14th class citizen of being black, even though you can look at him and kind of tell he's not really that black, right? In terms of, his phenotype, skin color, hair, all that other stuff, right? But there was always some form of agitation, some form of resistance to a system, a lattice work of systemically racist oppression that the U.S. and particularly southern states had put up, right? So that's always been the case. So I don't want to hear when the civil rights movement began in 1954, or see someone write when the civil rights movement began or ended in this part of the civil rights movement in 1965. The reality is there's always been a movement. The real question is, how do we get from the standard sort of hit and miss kinds of things to mass mobilization in the period of the 1950s and 1960s? That's what's different. It's not that there wasn't a movement before. I mean, A. Philip Randolph threatened to do a march on Washington in 1941 and got Executive Order 8802 from FDR in response, and to protect black workers so that black folks can find jobs in defense industries during the war, right? So this isn't, there's always been a movement. The question is, how do we get to mass mobilization? And the answer to that is, it's the 50s, guys. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in this post-World War II period that was not really going on earlier. Number one, TV. I know, television. Why would television be important? Well, let's be honest. Since we lived in a very segregated society, whether you're talking about Jim Crow segregation in the South or restrictive covenants and residential de facto segregation up north, whites didn't spend lots of time with black folks outside of jobs, right? And even then, oftentimes white workers didn't like working side by side with Negroes. And let's be honest, a lot of those white workers would have basically been in management or middle management or in a supervisory level position, with us having more menial labor types of jobs. So generally speaking, we didn't go to church together. We didn't, we being black and white Americans, and go to church together. They didn't hang out in the same clubs unless it was between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. on weekends. And then, integration from a sexual standpoint was taking place, which, that's a whole nother story. Not a good one, obviously, in a very racist society like this one. So there's that. So, but TV is important. Why is media important? Because it's a new medium. And a new medium means that you get to see things on it that you wouldn't normally see in everyday life. And one of those things is black protest, right? So it's not that blacks didn't protest before 1954. It's that by the time you get into this period between 1954 55 up until the mid 1960s, now you're actually seeing the protests on TV. You're hearing the demands from prominent black folk on TV. You're hearing people who are very erudite, with PhDs, who are professors, who are ministers, who are people who of certain respectability standards saying things that wow, I didn't know black people could think. I didn't know black people were this smart. I mean, I'm not, this is literally the way whites in this period thought about black people. There are a lot of white people who still think this about black people, but back then, there was the norm to basically say that we couldn't articulate ourselves very well and those kinds of things. So seeing that on TV and having contrast with someone like Bull Connor, who's just like, these Negroes need to calm down kind of things, and spraying hoses on 13 and 14-year-olds who are protesting in a children's march in Birmingham, just for the right to have to drink at the same water fountain, use the same bathrooms. I mean, really, when you really think about, why would I want to use the same bathroom with somebody who can barely wipe their butt? I mean, be honest with you, would probably spit in the water fountain before I can get a drink out of it. I mean, be honest with you, I don't want to be doing that. But the truth is, it was a form of, discrimination and inequality to not even be able to use the same stuff, right? Equality is equality, right? Whether it's bad equality or good equality, equality is equality. And so when you talk about the civil rights movement, the big C, big R, big M movement, media is really important. It is highly important to have that media available, right, in order to make this movement work. Because without it, especially being on TV, you might hear about Bull Connor spraying down dozens upon dozens of students with a high pressure hose that tears the clothes off of kids and breaks through skin and causes bruising and broken bones and stuff, right? You might hear about it, but seeing it might have a little bit more of an impact on you, especially if you're kind of like, oh, I don't know about what these Negroes are doing types, right? But I don't, but I'm not sure if I agree with everything that they're doing. But you see them going, whoa, that is way out of proportion discrimination. Maybe we need to do something. It might even motivate, you know, some otherwise recalcitrant white folks to go, you know what? We need to get rid of segregation in the South. We need to get rid of Jim Crow segregation, right? At the very least, that's part of it. The other part of it, of course, is this idea of nonviolence, right? Nonviolent protests. Why nonviolent protests? Why does this mix well with the other aspects of the movement? And here's why. If you see, if the general image, particularly of the Soviet Union, has the second world, right? Because there's a first world, a second world, and a third world. This used to be a political thing. We turned it into something completely economic. But back in the days of the Cold War, and this is the key thing that's important here, back in the days of the Cold War, there was a propaganda war between which society was better, a totalitarian communist society or purportedly democratic capitalist one, right? We think we won that. I don't know if we've won that argument yet, given what we've seen in the last 30 years, what we've seen in the last 2.5 years. I would say that they're both wrong. Both are bad, right? Totalitarianism is bad. Communism, if it can't be fully achieved, is probably bad. Capitalism hasn't done a whole lot of people great shakes the last 30 years, and what kind of democracy do we really have when a lot of people can't really fully partake in it, whether we're talking about then or now. And so there was a lot of there was a propaganda war that went with the Cold War. And part of the image of the propaganda of the Cold War were of movies and films and other things in which, from the Soviet side, in which it showed armed whites beating up and killing and breaking property of black people, because you can find those images. Whether you're talking about the race riots in Detroit or the race riots in um, Chicago in 1919 or Washington, D.C. in 1919 or Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, you could find tons of images like that. In the U.S., part of the reason why the federal government responds so favorably to, or trying to advance the rights of African Americans and to protect their rights, protect their civil and human rights, is because there's a propaganda war going on, right? And part of that propaganda war is the reality that the U.S. is a really violent society and will do anything, including kill black people, in order to maintain white supremacy. How can you be the democracy, that freedom of equality, of goodness, when you're beating up your own people? Is what the Soviet side could do with propaganda on any day of the week based on that footage, right? And Martin Luther King and other members of the SCLC wanted to take advantage of, quite frankly, TV to show that, hey, we're not the side provoking all this violence, it's the other side. It's, white racists running around trying to hurt, maim, kill black people, right? And every time they show footage of armed whites beating up people, whether it's Selma in 1965, whether it's Birmingham in 1963, or any number of other instances that are happening during the course of the Civil Rights era, right? The Civil Rights Movement era, right? It's a black eye to the U.S., and so the U.S. has to respond in a way that's positive, and usually that means the federal government. So the federal government takes it upon itself to protect, um, nonviolent black and white, and some mostly black, some white marchers and sit-inners and die-inners and whoever else because they have a First Amendment right to assembly, that kind of thing, you know when Martin Luther King gets locked up during the Birmingham campaign and writes letter from a Birmingham jail, he talks about the very fact that it's perfectly fine for you to require permits for us to march. But when you're talking about putting people in jail and beating them up and hitting them with bully clubs, you know, it makes the First Amendment kind of look like it doesn't really exist for black people. And if it doesn't exist for black people, well, it doesn't really exist for anybody. And so that, using that as leverage in this larger Cold War propaganda war was very effective, highly effective in mobilizing the federal government, whether it was Eisenhower, who was definitely not a friend of black folk, or John F. Kennedy, or Lyndon Baines Johnson, to do things like pass the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and eventually the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and so many other little things that they did to protect, people like Ruby Bridges, who are going to school in Little Rock, and so on and so forth, so that people didn't get hurt or killed. Doing this. They still got traumatized. Being spit at is still not, while obviously not the same as being put in the hospital in a coma for a week, like the late John Lewis. But the truth of the matter is getting spit on and being ostracized every day is just as traumatic. And so we have to give credit to those people who went through all of that in order to protect our basic rights. We're not talking about more rights than anybody else. Really basic rights. The right to go to school. It's a pretty basic right. The right to, go to a movie theater and sit where you want to sit in a movie theater, on a bus, or on a train. I mean, these are pretty basic rights. They're at the bottom. They change nothing. These are symbolic rights of no, of more of anything else. I mean, it has a real effect, but psychologically to not have them. But we're not talking about the right of folks to I don't know, get degrees, be middle class, to access to the same level of health care that you would give to anybody else, that kind of thing. So these are really basic things people are fighting for. They had to do all of this work, put their lives and livelihoods and their families at risk for these really basic rights to be enforced. And that's if there's anything that should come out of this, is not whether King's right about nonviolence and Malcolm X isn't, which we'll talk about more next week, but really the fact that they had to do so much for so basic a thing. So